All right, so buckle up because today we're diving deep into the Truro murders. The ones that shook South Australia back in the 70s. We're talking multiple victims, a remote location, and a killer who died before facing justice. That's all pretty chilling stuff, right?
Yeah, and it really gets you thinking about what makes a serial killer stop. Is it getting caught, a change of heart, or is there something else at play? I mean, our source material really dives into the nitty-gritty of human behavior
Yeah.
and the ripple effects of, such horrific crimes.
Right, and so it all kicks off with this couple, Bill and Valda Thomas, just out mushroom hunting near Truro. Sounds pretty peaceful, doesn't it? But
Mhm.
then, bam, they stumble upon a human leg bone. Not just any bone either, it's still in a shoe with traces of painted toenails.
That little detail, the painted toenails, ended up being huge in solving the case. It helped identify the remains as 18-year-old Veronica Knight, who'd been missing for over a year. At first, police thought maybe she just wandered off and died accidentally, but her connection to Truro was a total mystery.
Yeah, that's strange. Why would a young woman from Adelaide end up so far out in the sticks? And what about her trip to Melbourne that she had planned? Doesn't sound like someone who'd just wander off into the bush.
You're right, it doesn't. And that's where Detective Sergeant Bob Giles comes in. He was working missing persons and started noticing a pattern of young women vanishing from Adelaide, all between Christmas of '76 and February of '77.
So he's seeing these disappearances, all young women, many last seen around bus stops, all from stable homes, no signs of running away. What did he think was going on?
Giles was convinced they had a serial killer on their hands. But sadly, that theory wasn't exactly a hit back then. You gotta imagine, South Australia in the '70s, a serial killer just wasn't on anyone's radar.
But Giles stuck to his guns, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
His dedication was a game changer for this case.
Now, this is where we meet the Makita family. Their 16-year-old daughter, Julie, vanishes after a night out with friends. The only lead is a witness seeing her get into a white car, not much to go on.
It was a nightmare for the Makitas. Julie's journal entries hinted at some risky behavior, which just added to the confusion and worry. And then Detective Giles approached them with his serial killer theory. That conversation changed everything.
I can't imagine what it must have been like for them hearing that their daughter might be connected to these murders. How did they react?
They made a incredibly brave decision. They decided to go public, hoping to raise awareness and maybe get some tips.
Wow, that takes guts. Especially back then with all the stigma around missing persons cases. It sounds like their decision was a turning point, though.
It was. Their story grabbed everyone's attention, and with the media breathing down their necks, the police had to take the serial killer theory seriously.
But it was another gruesome discovery that really sealed the deal, wasn't it?
Sadly,
Yeah.
yeah.
What happened?
Near Truro, not far from where they found Veronica Knight's remains, some rabbit hunters stumbled across another skull. Turned out to be Sylvia Pittman, a 16-year-old aspiring model who disappeared 2 years earlier.
Two young women, both found near Truro, both missing for a long time. There's no way that's a coincidence.
Yeah, it was a chilling confirmation of Giles's theory. The discovery of Sylvia's remains and her guardian angel necklace found with them triggered a massive search around Truro. People were terrified. They knew a serial killer was out there, and everyone was on edge.
And then, if I'm remembering right, they find even more victims around Truro.
That's right.
Tell me about that.
They found 15-year-old Connie Jordanites who'd run away after a fight with her parents. And then there was 26-year-old Vicky Howe, a single mom who vanished after an argument with her boyfriend. It became clear that this killer wasn't just targeting one type of victim. He was preying on vulnerability, on people who might slip through the cracks.
So, four confirmed victims, all found close to each other, and panic setting in. Did the investigators finally catch a break?
That's where things take a surprising turn. The key piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. A small-time crook named James Miller, locked up in Adelaide for stealing sunglasses.
Wait, a petty thief held the key to a serial killer case. How?
While Miller was in prison, he became obsessed with another inmate, Christopher Robin Worrell, a charismatic young guy serving time for rape. They formed a weird bond, even becoming blood brothers.
Blood brothers. That's creepy. What happened when Worrell got out?
They met up on the outside and lived a pretty transient life. Petty crime, one-night stands, that kind of thing. Miller later said Worrell had these dark moods, like something was off, bad things were happening.
So Miller was close to Worrell, noticed these red flags, and knew about the Truro murders. Did he put it all together?
He did. And the weight of what he knew or suspected became too much. He was driven by guilt and fear, so he confided in Worrell's ex-girlfriend, Amelia. He told her things about the murders that only the killer could have known.
He confessed to Worrell's ex. That's a big risk. Did she believe him?
Amelia was torn. She believed Miller, but she also felt like implicating a dead man wouldn't do any good, just stir up trouble. It was a tough spot. But the reward for info on the Truro killer was getting bigger and bigger, and someone close to Amelia decided to tip off the cops.
That tip led to Miller's arrest, right?
It did.
Did he confess right away?
At first, Miller denied everything. But the detectives knew about Amelia's fear that Worrell's soul wouldn't rest until the bodies were found. They used that to appeal to Miller's conscience, and that's when he broke. He agreed to lead them to the remaining victims.
Wow, so he takes them on this grim road trip. That's a huge turning point.
It is. But before we get into that, let's just take a second to think about what this all means. Miller, this seemingly small-time cook, held the key to solving these awful murders. His confession, driven by guilt, fear, and maybe even wanting some notoriety, brought some closure to the families. But it also opened up a whole can of worms. Questions about how involved he really was, what his relationship with Worrell was truly like, and what was driving these heinous crimes.
Yeah, it's a lot to process, and it feels like we're just getting started. The story of James Miller and his journey with the detectives is definitely one we need to unpack. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. What role does chance play in solving a crime? Would the Truro murders still be unsolved if not for a random theft, a prison friendship, and a big reward?
It's a good question. It really shows you how unpredictable criminal investigations can be. Sometimes the smallest detail, the most unexpected connection, can crack the whole thing wide open. In this case, it was a bunch of seemingly random events that brought the truth to light, and it gave the victims' families at least a little bit of justice.
Okay, so last we heard, Miller was taking the detectives to the other victims. What was that like for them?
Can you imagine the tension in that car? Driving through the night with a guy who says he helped bury these women? And here's the thing. Miller was totally calm the whole time. He even stopped for snacks along the way.
Seriously, that's so strange. Like he wasn't even fazed by what they were doing.
Right. It says a lot about his state of mind.
So did he take them straight to the bodies?
The first stop was this abandoned farmhouse. That's where they found Julie Makita. Her things were still in her pockets.
Oh, wow. That's got to be so hard for her family, even if they knew it was coming.
Absolutely.
Where did they go next?
Miller led them to a rifle range. That's where Tanya Kenny's remains were. And then finally to a deserted beach. Deborah Lamb was buried there.
All these different places. It's like Worrell was trying to be extra cruel.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how he chose those spots. Was it random, or was there some meaning behind it?
I guess we'll never know. Worrell took those answers to the grave.
He did. But let's talk about Miller's confession for a minute. He claimed he was just a scared bystander, forced to go along with everything because he was afraid of Worrell. But his story kept changing.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. His accounts of the murders were all over the place.
Right. At first, he said the murders happened after Worrell raped the women. Then he claimed the women actually consented to sex and bondage.
It's like he was trying to make himself look better and blame the victims. Awful.
Yeah, it's classic victim blaming, trying to shift the responsibility away from the killer.
We can't just take Miller's word for it, can we?
Definitely not.
So they have the confession and the bodies. Sounds like a slam dunk case, right?
Well, not so fast. There were some legal issues. The fact that Miller wasn't charged before he led them to the bodies raised some eyebrows.
Ah, so his defense team could argue that the process wasn't fair.
Exactly.
Did he plead guilty?
No, he went with a risky move. He gave an unsworn statement instead of testifying.
What does that mean?
Basically, he told his version of the murders while being under oath.
So he couldn't be cross-examined.
That's right. But it also meant the jury couldn't really judge how believable he was.
Sounds like a gamble.
It was.
What did the prosecution say? How did they try to prove he wasn't just an innocent bystander?
They argued that Miller was part of a joint enterprise, meaning even if he didn't kill anyone himself, he was in on the plan. They pointed to the fact that he was at several of the crime scenes, and that he knew things only the killer would know. Plus, his story kept changing, which made him look less credible.
So joint enterprise means even without pulling the trigger, he's still responsible.
Right.
Did the jury believe it?
Mostly, yeah. Miller was found guilty of 6 out of the 7 murders.
Wow, 6 life sentences.
Yeah.
It's crazy how someone could fall under the spell of a guy like Worrell.
It is a fascinating question, isn't it? What is it about certain people that draws others in?
That's something to think about. But, we can't forget about the bigger picture here. There was a lot of victim blaming going on back
Oh,
then.
absolutely. It's disheartening. One newspaper even published an editorial blaming the victims for accepting rides from strangers.
That's just awful.
It's a terrible example of how society often shifts the blame to the victims instead of holding the perpetrator accountable.
Yeah, it's like saying it's their fault for being vulnerable.
Exactly.
We have to be careful about that kind of thinking.
We do.
Thankfully, some people spoke out against that victim blaming.
He did.
And Neri Makita, Julie's mother, she wrote a powerful response.
She did.
She stood up for community responsibility and awareness. She wouldn't let her daughter be just another cautionary tale.
That's so powerful.
So what happened to James Miller after he was convicted? Did he ever admit what he did?
No, he always claimed he was innocent. He stuck to the story he told in that unsworn statement. He even co-wrote a book from prison, giving his twisted version of events and saying he was the real victim. Miller died in prison back in 2008 from liver failure.
So he died without ever taking responsibility.
It seems that way.
It's sad to think that even with the convictions, there are still so many questions.
There are.
But we can't deny the impact this case had on South Australia.
It was huge.
It shattered the idea that these small towns were safe and innocent. It made people realize that evil can be anywhere.
It can.
What lessons can we learn from the Truro murders? How can we stop something like this from happening again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a tough one. But I think it starts with awareness and education and challenging the things in our society that silence victims and protect abusers.
We need to support victims and encourage them to speak out.
Absolutely.
And we need a justice system that holds perpetrators accountable.
That's crucial.
Those are important things to consider. The Truro murders really forced people to think about personal responsibility and community safety.
They did.
But before we finish up, I want to talk about some of the unanswered questions. Even with the convictions, there are still mysteries.
Oh, definitely.
What are your thoughts on that?
There are a lot of things we still don't know. Like, did Worrell have other accomplices besides Miller? We may never know for sure.
It's scary to think he might have had help. And what about his motive? Why did he do it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Was it just about power and control? Or was there something deeper going on in his head?
I guess we'll never really understand.
And then there's the thought that there might be more victims out there. People whose families are still searching for answers.
That's heartbreaking. But even with all these unanswered questions, we have to acknowledge the amazing work Detective Giles and his team did. They never gave up, even when people doubted them.
Absolutely. Their dedication brought some justice to the victims and their families.
They're the real heroes in this story. And, it's easy to get lost in the details of the case, but we can't forget about the human cost.
Right. Real people suffered unimaginable loss because of these murders.
The families of the victims have been through so much, but they've shown incredible strength and resilience.
They have. They never stopped fighting for justice, and they've worked tirelessly to keep the memory of their loved ones alive.
It's really inspiring.
It is.
Thinking back on everything we've discussed, one thing that really stood out to me was Worrell's early release from prison. He served barely any time for rape before he was back out on the streets.
It's disturbing, isn't it? It shows how our justice system can fail. Sometimes dangerous people slip through the cracks.
It makes you wonder if those murders could have been prevented.
Yeah. Were there any warning signs that were missed? Any chances to intervene?
It's hard to say for sure.
It is. But we know Worrell had a history of violence. He didn't respect the law.
Maybe if they had looked closer at his mental state, things would have been different.
Maybe.
It's just a tragedy all around.
It is.
This case really highlights the need for a different approach to crime prevention. We need to focus on more than just punishment.
Right.
We need to address the root causes of crime. Things like poverty, addiction, and mental health issues.
I agree.
We need programs to help people who are struggling.
And we need to teach young people about healthy relationships and respect for others.
We need to create a society where people feel safe asking for help.
Absolutely.
But we can't just rely on society to fix everything.
Right.
What can we do as individuals to protect ourselves and the people we care about?
Well, we need to be aware of our surroundings. Trust our gut feelings.
Don't be afraid to speak up if something seems off.
Exactly. And talk to your friends and family about safety. Make sure everyone knows they can come to you for help.
These are all really important things to keep in mind. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by cases like this, but we can use those feelings to make a difference.
We can.
We can learn from the past and work towards a better future.
I like that.
After this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
That's a good question. I think it's this. Even in the face of pure evil, there's always hope. We see it in the families of the victims, their strength, their determination to get justice, their love for their lost loved ones. That's where we find hope. And it's our responsibility to learn from these tragedies and prevent them from happening again.
That's a beautiful thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Truro murders. It's been a tough but important journey. And to our listener, thank you for being here with us. We hope this has made you more aware, more understanding, and more committed to making the world a safer and kinder place.